Officer Hank Miller adjusted his patrol cap as he walked toward the kennels behind the police station. 12 years on the force had taught him to trust his instincts, follow orders, and keep his head down. At 42, he'd seen every kind of criminal. Every excuse, every sob story he thought he knew how the world worked. Miller, meet your new partner, Sergeant Rodriguez called out, leading a sleek German shepherd toward him. The dog was magnificent, black and tan coat gleaming under the morning sun. Ears alert, dark eyes that seemed to hold an unusual depth of intelligence, unlike the other canines. Hank had worked with this one, didn't bark or strain against the leash. He simply observed. This is Kilo, Rodriguez continued. 2 years old, trained at the state facility, top marks in obedience, drug detection, and suspect apprehension. He's yours. Hank extended his hand, letting Kilo sniff his fingers. The dog's nose was cold and wet, his breathing calm. When their eyes met, Hank felt something unusual like. The dog was studying him, measuring him, somehow. Good boy, Hank said, though. Kilo's expression remained neutral, almost thoughtful. Their first week together went smoothly. Kilo responded to every command with precision. Sit, stay, Heluk, order executed. Flawlessly. During traffic stops, Kilo remained alert but composed. He found drugs in 2 separate vehicles, without a single false positive. Hank began to feel confident about their partnership. It was a Tuesday afternoon when everything changed. Call came in as they patrolled Riverside Park, a modest green space in the Oakwood neighborhood. Hank knew the area well, mostly black families, working class, the kind of place that generated more calls than he liked dealing with. Unit 47, we have a report of suspicious activity at Riverside Park. Caller says there's a black male, approximately 30 years old, possibly dealing drugs near the playground equipment. Hank keyed his radio. Unit 47 responding as they pulled into the park's small lot. Hank scanned the area. Families were scattered across the grass, children on swings, mothers pushing strollers, teenagers playing basketball on the court. Everything looked normal until his eyes landed on a figure sitting alone under an old oak tree. A black man, just as described, sat cross-legged on the grass. With a notebook in his lap, he was sketching something, occasionally looking up at the playground where children played. To Hank, it looked suspicious, a grown man with no kids watching children. Sitting alone. There's our guy, Hank muttered, opening the car door, but when he looked back at Kilo, the dog hadn't moved. He sat in the passenger seat, ears forward, staring not at the man under the tree, but at Hank himself. Come on, Kilo, let's go check this out. Kilo followed, but his usual eager stride was replaced by something more cautious. They approached the man slowly, Hank's hand resting on his service weapon out of habit. The man looked up as they approached. He was younger than Hank had initially thought, maybe early 30s, with kind eyes. Behind wire-rimmed glasses, his notebook was filled with detailed sketches of the playground, the trees, the children playing. Drawn with remarkable skill. Afternoon, the man said politely, setting down his pencil. Beautiful day, isn't it? I'm Officer Miller. Mind if I ask what you're doing here? Just drawing. The man held up his notebook. I'm an art teacher at Jefferson Elementary School. Starts next week, and I'm working on some illustrations for my classroom. The kids love seeing pictures of places they know. It was a reasonable explanation, but Hank's training kicked in. People lied, criminals had excuses. This guy could be casing the area, planning something. ID please. The man reached slowly into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet, extracting a driver's license. Jamal Washington, he said, handing it over. Hank examined the license, then looked down at Kilo. The dog was sitting beside the man, now not in an aggressive stance but calmly, as if he belonged there. Kilo's tail gave a small wag when Jamal glanced at him. Beautiful dog, Jamal said. What's his name? Kilo. Hank was studying the ID, running the name through his mental database. No immediate red flags, but something about the situation still felt off to him. Kilo suddenly stood and walked directly to Jamal, sitting down beside him with his shoulder touching the man's leg. This wasn't attack positioning or even alert positioning. If Hank didn't know better, he'd say Kilo was being friendly. Is he always this social? Jamal asked, carefully reaching out to pet Kilo's head. The dog leaned into the touch, eyes closing. Briefly, Hank frowned. In their week together, Kilo had been professional with everyone, ever hostile, but never affectionate. Either not. Usually something was bothering him about the whole interaction. The man seemed genuine, his story checked out, and Kilo clearly wasn't detecting anything threatening. But Hank's instincts, shaped by years of suspicion and departmental culture, kept nagging at him. Well, keep it moving, Hank said, finally handing back the license. Don't want any complaints about loitering. Jamal nodded, gathering his art supplies. Of course, officer, have a good day. As they walked back to the patrol car, Kilo kept looking over his shoulder at Jamal. When Hank opened the car door, the dog hesitated before jumping and something he'd never done before. What's gotten into you, boy? Hank asked, but Kilo just stared out the window at the man under the tree driving away. Hank couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened, though he couldn't put his finger on what. In the passenger seat, Kilo remained unusually quiet, his intelligent eyes reflecting a depth of understanding that made Hank oddly uncomfortable. That night, filing his report, Hank wrote, responded to suspicious person call at Riverside Park, subject identified as Jamal Washington claims to be art teacher, no violations observed, situation resolved without incident, but as he typed the words he found himself thinking about those sketches in the notebook, the gentle way Jamal had spoken, and most puzzling of all, Kilo's unexpectedly warm response to a man Hank's training told him to be suspicious of for the first time. In his 12-year career, officer Hank Miller went to bed wondering if his instincts might be wrong. 3 weeks passed before Hank and Kilo encountered Jamal Washington. Again, in that time, they'd made several arrests, conducted routine traffic stops, and Kilo had performed flawlessly in every situation. The dog's earlier behavior at the park seemed like an anomaly filed away in Hank's mind as one of those unexplainable moments that happened in police work. The call came in just after 8 p.m. on a Friday evening. Dispatch crackled through the radio. Unit 47. We have a report of possible drug activity near the Riverside Park playground. Caller reports seeing a black male, approximately 6 feet tall, acting suspiciously near the children's area. Says he's been there for about 30 minutes, pacing and making phone calls. Hank recognized the location immediately. Unit 47 responding as they drove toward the park. Hank felt his adrenaline rise. Evening drug deals weren't uncommon in this area, and the playground provided good cover and multiple escape routes. He'd made several arrests there over the years. Time to earn our keep, Kilo, he said, glancing at his partner. The dog sat alert in the passenger seat, but something in his posture seemed differentless, eager than usual. The park was mostly empty when they arrived, just a few joggers on the path, and a couple walking their dog in the distance near the playground. Hank spotted their suspect immediately. Was Jamal Washington. The man was standing near a bench, phone pressed to his ear, gesturing with his free hand as he spoke, even from a distance. Hank could see tension in his posture, not the calm, gentle demeanor from their previous encounter. Looks like our art teacher is branching out, Hank muttered, reaching for his radio to request backup. Something about the scene felt different this time. More urgent. Unit 47 to dispatch. I've got eyes on the suspect. Requesting backup unit to my location. Copy that. Unit 47. Backup is en route. ETA 5 minutes. Hank decided to wait for backup before making contact, but as he watched, Jamal ended his phone call and sat heavily on the bench, putting his head in his hands. The gesture looked more like exhaustion or grief than criminal activity, but Hank had learned not to trust appearances. When Officer Martinez arrived as backup, Hank briefed him quickly. Blackmail, been here 30 minutes, making phone calls, could be coordinating a deal. I'll approach with Kilo, you circle around behind in case he runs. Martinez nodded and moved to position himself on the far side of the playground. Ready, boy? Hank asked, opening Kilo's door. The dog stepped out slowly, not with his usual eager energy, but with what almost looked like reluctance. They approached Jamal from the front, Hank's flashlight beam cutting through the gathering dusk. Jamal looked up as they got closer, and Hank saw something unexpected in the man's eyes. Houston stress, but also a flash of recognition. Officer Miller, Jamal said, standing slowly. We meet again, Mr. Washington. Mind telling me what you're doing here? Jamal glanced around the empty playground, then back at Hank. I got some difficult news today. Sometimes I come here to think it's quiet. The explanation sounded reasonable, but dispatch had reported suspicious behavior, and Hank had learned to trust the community's instincts. Someone had been concerned enough to call police. The caller said you were making a lot of phone calls, acting agitated. That true? Jamal's jaw tightened slightly. I received word that my father is in the hospital. I've been trying to coordinate with family members, make arrangements to get to Detroit. Is that illegal? Again, a reasonable explanation, but something about the situation was setting off Hank's alarm bells. Maybe it was the late hour, maybe it was the caller's concerns, or maybe it was just years of training telling him that people in this neighborhood, especially at night, were often up to no good. Going to need to search you, Hank said. Just a precaution. Search me for what? Drugs, weapons, anything. You shouldn't have. Jamal spread his arms wide, clearly frustrated but compliant. Go ahead, Hank began. A quick pat down, checking pockets and waistband. Jamal's phone buzzed constantly during the search, text messages and missed calls lighting up the screen. Popular guy, Hank commented. My family, Jamal said quietly. They're worried about Dad. Hank found nothing suspicious while at Key's phone, a pack of gum. Everything a normal person would carry, but his training kicked in again. Dealers were smart. They hid things. Kilo, search, Hank commanded, pointing at a nearby trash can, and then, at the bench where Jamal had been sitting for the first time in their partnership. Kilo didn't immediately obey. The dog looked at Hank, then at Jamal, then back at Hank. His tail was low, ears slightly back. Language Hank had never seen from him before. Kilo, search. Hank repeated more forcefully. Instead of following the command, Kilo walked directly to Jamal and sat down beside him, exactly as he had 3 weeks earlier. The dog's posture was calm, protective. Even and when Jamal looked down at him, Kilo's tail gave a gentle wag. Hank felt his face flush with embarrassment and anger. Martinez was watching from across the playground, probably wondering why Hank couldn't control his own canine. What the hell, Kilo? Hank grabbed the dog's leash and pulled him away from Jamal. He's not your friend, maybe. He knows I'm not the enemy, Jamal said quietly. The comment hit Hank wrong. Are you suggesting I don't know how to do my job? I'm suggesting that your dog is a better judge of character than you give him credit for. Hank's anger spiked. This guy was making him look incompetent in front of backup, and worse, his own dog was taking the suspect's side. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. For what? Public disturbance. Suspicious behavior. I'll find something. Jamal's expression changed, showing the first real flash of anger Hank had seen from him. You're arresting me for sitting on a bench and talking on the phone. Turn around. Now as Hank reached for his handcuffs, something extraordinary happened. Kilo stepped between them. The dog didn't growl or bare his teeth, but he positioned himself directly in front of Jamal. Facing Hank, his body language clear. You'll have to go through Kilo heel. Hank commanded. Kilo didn't move. Heel. Still nothing. The dog stood his ground, dark eyes locked on his handler, conveying something Hank had never seen before. Defiance approached from behind. Everything okay here, Miller? Hank was sweating now, completely at a loss. In all his years of police work, he'd never had a canine refuse direct commands, especially not to protect a suspect. My dog seems to be malfunctioning, Hank said through gritted teeth. Maybe. Your dog is working perfectly, Jamal said softly. Maybe he sees something you don't think. Looked down at Kilo, who was still positioned protectively in front of Jamal, still staring at his handler with those intelligent, measuring eyes. For a moment, something shifted in Hank's perception, like looking at one of those optical illusion pictures where suddenly you see the hidden image. What if Kilo wasn't malfunctioning? What if he was doing exactly what he was trained to do: detect threats and protect the innocent? What if Hank was the threat? The thought was so disturbing that Hank immediately pushed it away. He was a police officer. He served and protected. This man was suspicious, and his dog was having some kind of training issue. Where? Done here, Hank said, finally, holstering his handcuffs. But I'll be keeping an eye on you, Washington. Jamal nodded, reaching down to gently pat Kilo's head one more time. Thank you, he whispered to the dogas. They walked back to the patrol car. Kilo kept looking over his shoulder at Jamal, who was gathering his things and walking toward the parking area. The dog's reluctance was obvious. Didn't want to leave. What's gotten into you? Hank asked. Once they were back in the car, Kilo turned those dark eyes on him again, and for a moment, Hank felt like the dog was trying to tell him something important, something he was too stubborn or too blind to understand. Driving home that night, Hank made a mental note to call the canine training facility in the morning. Clearly, Kilo needed some refresher work on following commands, but deep down in a part of his mind he didn't want to acknowledge. Another thought was growing. What if Kilo's training was perfect? What if the dog was seeing something that Hank, blinded by years of assumptions and biases, simply couldn't see? What if Jamal Washington wasn't the problem at all? 2 days after the incident, at the park, Hank sat across from Captain Reynolds in the precinct's administrative office. The canine training coordinator, a stern woman named Detective Sarah Chen, was also present, reviewing Kilo's behavioral reports on her tablet. So, your dog refused direct commands? Captain Reynolds asked, leaning back in his chair. Twice now with the same suspect. Hank replied, feeling his credibility slipping away with each word. First time he got overly friendly, second time he actually positioned himself between me and the subject when I tried to make an arrest. Detective Chen looked up from her tablet. Kilo's training scores were exceptional. No behavioral issues noted during his certification. Has he been responsive in other situations? Perfect. Every traffic stop, every search, every commandmental, he encounters this particular individual. Tell me about this individual. Captain Reynolds said. Hank pulled out his notebook. Jamal Washington, 32, art teacher at Jefferson Elementary, lives in the Oakwood district. No priors, no outstanding warrants, but he keeps showing up in areas where we get suspicious person calls. What kind of suspicious behavior? Loitering in parks, making multiple phone calls. Observed watching children. He's an art teacher, Detective Chen interrupted. Watching children as part of his job description. Hank felt defensive. Look, I've been doing this for 12 years. I know when something doesn't feel right, and I know my dog shouldn't be protecting suspects. Captain Reynolds drummed his fingers on the desk. I want Kilo recertified, full behavioral assessment. Until then, you're working solo patrol. Walking out of the captain's office, Hank felt like his career was unraveling. First his dog had betrayed him, now his supervisors were questioning his judgment. All because of one suspicious art teacher who somehow had Kilo wrapped around his finger. That evening, off duty and still stewing over the meeting, Hank decided to do some surveillance of his own. If Washington was up to something, Hank would find the evidence and vindicate both himself and his concerns. He parked across the street from Jefferson Elementary just as the school day was ending. Within minutes, he spotted Jamal emerging from the building carrying a large portfolio and talking with a woman who appeared to be another teacher. Hank followed at a distance. As Jamal walked to his car, a modest Honda Civic with art supplies visible in the back seat. Nothing suspicious so far, but dealers were good at maintaining covers. Jamal drove to a small apartment complex in the Oakwood neighborhood. Hank parked where he could observe the building and settled in to wait. If Washington was dealing drugs, Hank would eventually see a pattern of visitors, quick exchanges, people coming and going at odd hours. Past Jamal didn't leave his apartment. No unusual visitors. The only activity Hank observed, was an elderly woman from the same complex, stopping by briefly with what appeared to be a casserole dish at 9 p.m. Hank was about to give up when his police radio crackled to live all units. We have a domestic disturbance at 428 Maple Street Apartment 3B. Possible assault in progress. Any unit available to respond. Hank grabbed his radio unit 47, responding he was off duty, but 428 Maple Street was only 2 blocks away, and backup might be needed racing toward the address with emergency lights flashing. Hank arrived to find another patrol car already on scene. Officer Martinez was standing outside the building with a distraught woman holding a crying baby. What's the situation? Hank asked. Boyfriend got violent, Martinez explained. He's barricaded himself in the apartment, says he's got a gun, won't come out. The woman and kid got away, but we think there might be another child still inside. Hank's blood ran cold. Another child, her 6-year-old son. She's not sure if he got out or if he's hiding somewhere in the apartment. This was exactly the kind of situation where Kilo's training would be invaluable. The dog could locate the child, assess threats, provide protection. But Kilo was back at the station pending his behavioral review. More units arrived, including a SWAT team and crisis negotiators. The standoff dragged on for 3 hours with no progress. The suspect, apparently high on drugs, alternated between screaming threats and deadly silence. They had no way of knowing if the child was inside, if he was hurt, or if he was being held hostage. It was nearly midnight when Hank noticed a familiar Honda Civic pulling up at the edge of the police perimeter. Jamal Washington got out of his car and approached the nearest officer. Excuse me, Jamal said, I live in the neighborhood. I heard there might be a child involved. Is there anything I can do to help? The officer was about to wave him away when Hank intervened. Washington, what are you doing here? Jamal looked surprised to see him. Officer Miller, I live just around the corner when I heard there was a crisis involving a child. He gestured toward the building. I work with kids every day. Sometimes they'll talk to a teacher when they won't talk to anyone else. Despite his suspicions about Jamal, Hank found himself considering the offer. They'd exhausted most other options and time was running out. Let me check with the incident commander, Hank said. 20 minutes later, Jamal was suited up in a bulletproof vest, being briefed by the crisis negotiation team. The plan was simple. If the child was inside and hiding, Jamal would try to establish contact and talk him toward a safe exit point while SWAT maintained their positions. Using a bullhorn, Jamal called out in a gentle, reassuring voice, hello, in there, my name is Mr. Washington. I'm a teacher at Jefferson Elementary. If there's a little boy in there, I want you to know you're not in trouble. We just want to make sure you're safe for long minutes. Nothing happened then. Barely audible came a small voice from somewhere inside the apartment. I'm scared. Eyes met Hank's across the command post in that moment. Hank saw something he'd missed before. Not the suspicious character he'd been profiling, but a man genuinely dedicated to protecting children. I know, you're scared, Jamal called back. What's your name? Tommy. Hi Tommy, are you hurt? No, I'm hiding in my closet. Over the next 30 minutes, Jamal carefully talked Tommy through moving from his hiding spot to a bedroom window where SWAT officers could safely extract him. The child, it turned out, had been hiding in his room throughout the entire standoff, too frightened to move until he heard a familiar, trustworthy voice. When Tommy was safely in his mother's arms, Jamal quietly removed his vest and prepared to leave. The incident commander shook his hand, thanking him for his help. Hank approached as Jamal was walking back to his car. That was good work. In there, Jamal paused. Thank you. I owe you an apology. Hank continued, the words coming harder than he'd expected. I've been seeing you as a problem when you were trying to help. Your dog saw it. Jamal said simply, maybe you should trust him more. As Jamal drove away, Hank stood alone on the sidewalk, replaying every interaction they'd had. The sketches in the park, the phone calls about his sick father, the willingness to risk his own safety to help a frightened child. How had he gotten it so wrong? The next morning, Hank requested a meeting with Captain Reynolds. When he walked into the office, he found Detective Chen was there again, along with Jamal Washington. Hank stopped short. What's going on? Captain Reynolds gestured to a chair. Sit down. Miller. Jamal stood up, and for the first time since Hank had known him, his demeanor was completely different. Gone was the gentle art teacher. In his place stood a man with unmistakable authority and confidence. Jamal reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a badge and identification that made Hank's blood freeze. Agent Jamal Washington, FBI, he said formally. Internal Affairs Division. The room seemed to spin around. Hank, FBI. Agent Washington has been conducting an investigation into racial profiling and excessive force complaints in our district. Captain Reynolds explained the surveillance and interactions you've been documenting were part of his assessment. Hank felt like the ground had disappeared beneath him. You've been investigating me? Not specifically, Jamal said, his voice now carrying the measured tone of a federal agent. I was investigating patterns of behavior that several community complaints have highlighted. Your interactions with me were illuminating. Detective Chen spoke up. Agent Washington requested that we test Kilo's responses during these encounters. He wanted to see if the dog would react differently to him when he wasn't displaying any threatening behavior. Kilo was doing exactly what he was trained to do, Jamal continued. He was assessing threats and responding appropriately. When he refused your commands, he was essentially telling you that I wasn't a threat. In fact, he was protecting someone who was on the same side of the law. That you're supposed to be on. Hank sat in stunned silence, processing the revelation. Every assumption he'd made, every suspicion he'd harbored, every moment of frustration with Kilo of it, based on his own biases rather than actual evidence. Am under arrest? Hank asked, quietly. That depends, Captain. Reynolds said Agent Washington's report will include recommendations about your conduct. But he's also noted your response last night during the hostage situation and your willingness to consider his help. Despite your previous suspicions, Jamal sat back down, and when he spoke again, his voice had returned to the gentle tone. Hank remembered from the park. Officer Miller, I don't think you're a bad person, but I think you've been trained to see threats where they don't exist, especially when those perceived threats look like me. Your dog sees more clearly than you do. Because he hasn't been conditioned by years of implicit bias. The words hit Hank like a physical blow, partly because they were delivered with understanding rather than anger, and partly because he was beginning to realize they were true. What happens now? Hank asked. Now, Captain Reynolds said you're going to participate in some additional training, bias recognition, community policing, cultural sensitivity, and Agent Washington has volunteered to help with that training. Hank looked across the table at the man he'd spent weeks profiling as a criminal, the man who had just volunteered to help salvage his career despite being subjected to repeated harassment. Why would you help me? Jamal smiled. Same gentle smile Hank had seen in the park, the same warmth that Kilo had recognized from the very beginning. Because change is possible, Officer Miller, and because your dog already knows you're capable of being better than you've been. 3 weeks after the revelation in Captain Reynolds' office, Hank found himself sitting in a stark conference room at police headquarters, facing a panel of 5 officials who would determine his professional fate. The Internal Affairs Review Board included Captain Reynolds, a representative from the mayor's office, the police chief, a community advocate, an agent. Jamal Washington himself. The last 3 weeks had been the most difficult of Hank's career. News of the FBI investigation had leaked to the local media, and while no charges had been filed, the court of public opinion was less forgiving. Local cop under investigation for racial profiling had been the headline that greeted him every morning. For a week, even worse was the silence at home. His wife, Sarah, had barely spoken to him since the story broke. Their 12-year-old daughter, Madison, asking uncomfortable questions about why Daddy was on the news. The career he'd built, the reputation he'd maintained, the respect he'd earned, all of it felt like it was slipping away. Kilo sat beside him now, the dog's presence one of the few comforting constants in his life. After the revelation about Agent Washington, Hank had requested that Kilo be returned to active duty with him, and surprisingly the request had been approved. The dog's behavior assessments had come back perfect, was simply doing exactly what he'd been trained to do. Officer Miller, Chief Martinez, began. This hearing is to review the circumstances surrounding your interactions with Agent Washington, assess your conduct, and determine appropriate action going forward. You understand that while this is an administrative proceeding, the outcomes could include suspension, termination, or criminal referral. I understand. Chief Agent Washington, would you please summarize your findings? Jamal stood up, holding a thick file folder. He was dressed in a crisp suit, every inch the federal agent Hank now knew him to be, but when their eyes met across the table, Hank saw something unexpected. Not hostility or vindication, but a kind of sad understanding. Over the course of 6 weeks, Jamal began, I conducted covert observations of police interactions in the Oakwood district following community complaints about potential racial profiling. During this period, I was approached by Officer Miller on 3 separate occasions while engaged in completely lawful activities. Jamal opened his folder and consulted his notes. The first encounter occurred while I was sketching in Riverside Park as part of my legitimate employment as an art teacher. Officer Miller's approach was professional, but his suspicions seemed disproportionate to the situation. The second encounter involved what Officer Miller perceived as suspicious phone activity, when in fact, I was coordinating family care for my hospitalized father. The third encounter escalated to a near-miss situation when Officer Miller attempted to detain me without probable cause. The community advocate, a woman named Dr. Patricia Williams, leaned forward. Agent Washington, in your professional opinion, were these interactions indicative of racial bias? Jamal paused and Hank held his breath. That's a complex question, Jamal said finally. Officer Miller's actions followed patterns consistent with what we see in cases of unconscious bias, suspicion, triggered primarily by my presence in certain locations, assumptions about my activities based on limited information, and escalation without clear justification. However, he looked directly at Hank. I also observed Officer Miller responding appropriately during the hostage crisis on Maple Street. When a child's life was at stake, he put aside his suspicions about me and allowed me to help. That suggests someone capable of growth and change. Dr. Williams made notes on her tablet. What about the canine's behavior during these encounters? This is perhaps the most interesting aspect of the case, Jamal replied. Kilo consistently refused to treat me as a threat despite direct commands. From his handler, K9SR, trained to read body language, vocal stress chemical signals that humans miss. Kilo was essentially doing his job. Perfectly detected no threat. Because no threat existed, but he disobeyed direct orders. Chief Martinez pointed out he prioritized threat assessment over blind obedience. Jamal corrected, which is exactly what we want our police dogs to do. The problem wasn't with Kilo's training or instincts, the problem was with the assumptions that led to those commands being given in the first places. If summoned by the mention of his name, Kilo stood up from where he'd been lying beside Hank's chair. Without any command, the dog walked around the conference table to where Jamal was standing. The room fell silent as Kilo sat down next to the FBI agent, his tail giving a gentle wag. Jamal looked down at the dog and couldn't suppress a small smile. Now Jamal said quietly, he's making his position clear. Chief Martinez frowned. Officer Miller, do you have control of your K9? Before Hank could answer, something shifted in his understanding. For weeks he'd been thinking about Kilo's behavior as disobedience, as a failure of training or control, but looking at the dog, now sitting calmly beside Agent Washington, Hank finally saw what everyone else in the room could see. Kilo wasn't being disobedient, he was being a good judge of character. Actually, Chief, Hank said, standing up, I think Kilo is demonstrating perfect control. He's showing us that Agent Washington isn't a threat, never was a threat, and that I was wrong to treat him as one. The words came out more easily than Hank had expected, and with them came a strange sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't trying to defend his actions or justify his suspicions. He was simply acknowledging what had become impossible to deny, made assumptions about Agent Washington, based on things that had nothing to do with his actual behavior. Hank continued, I saw a black man in certain places at certain times and let that override my training, my judgment, and my humanity. My dog saw better than I did. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of Kilo's breathing. Hank looked around the table at the 5 people who would decide his future. No, I screwed up, he said. I know my actions reflected poorly on this department and potentially violated Agent Washington's civil rights, but I also know that if you give me the chance, I can do better. Kilo's been trying to teach me that all along. Dr. Williams spoke first. Officer Miller, what would doing better look like to you? Hank had been thinking about this question for 3 weeks. Better training, for starters, not just the standard diversity workshops, but real education. About implicit bias, about how our assumptions can override our training. I want to understand how I got this so wrong. What else? Chief Martinez asked. Community engagement, real engagement, not just enforcement. I want to learn about the neighborhoods I patrol, the people I'm supposed to serve. I want them to see me as a partner, not an occupying force. Captain Reynolds leaned back in his chair. And how do we know this isn't just damage control? How do we know you've actually learned something? Before Hank could answer, Agent Washington spoke up. If I may, Chief Jamal said, still standing beside Kilo, who remained contentedly at his side, I'd like to share something that didn't make it into my official report. He looked directly at Hank. During the hostage situation, Officer Miller had every reason to exclude me from the operation. I had embarrassed him, caused problems with his K9, put his competence into question. He could have told the incident commander that I was unreliable or potentially dangerous. Jamal paused, stroking Kilo's head gently. Instead, when he saw that I might be able to help save a child's life, he put aside his personal feelings and advocated for letting me try. That tells me something important about his character. Dar Williams looked intrigued. What does it tell you? It tells me that underneath the bias and assumptions there's a police officer who genuinely wants to protect people. The bias is learned behavior, it can be unlearned. The protective instinct, the desire to serve, that's authentic. Hank felt his throat tighten. After weeks of public shame and professional uncertainty, hearing Agent Washington defend him was overwhelming him, not excusing Officer Miller's conduct. Jamal continued, what happened to me happens to countless people every day, and most of them don't have an FBI badge to reveal at the end of the encounter. But I am saying that I believe he's capable of growth. The mayor's representative, a man named David Chen, spoke for the first time. This is all very touching, but the community needs to see accountability. There have to be consequences. Absolutely, Hank said quickly. I'm not asking to avoid consequences, I'm asking for the chance to make this right. Chief Martinez consulted his notes. Officer Miller, you're aware that several community groups have called for your termination. Yes, sir. Dear, also aware that your actions could have resulted in a federal civil rights violation. Yes, sir. On the other hand, the chief continued, Agent Washington's report notes that no laws were actually broken, no excessive force was used, and you showed appropriate restraint. Even when frustrated, he set down his papers and looked directly at Hank. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to be suspended without pay for 30 days. During that time, you'll complete a comprehensive bias training program. You'll also perform 100 hours of community service in the Oakwood district, working with local organizations on community policing initiatives. Hank felt a mixture of relief and apprehension, and after that, After that, you'll be assigned to a community policing unit. Your job will be to build relationships, not just make arrests. Agent Washington has agreed to consult on your training and to evaluate your progress. Dr. Williams added, you'll also be required to participate in quarterly reviews with community representatives. This isn't a one-time fix, Officer Miller. This is a commitment to ongoing growth. I understand, Hank said. Thank you for the opportunity. Captain Reynolds stood up. This hearing is concluded. Officer Miller, report to my office tomorrow morning at 0800 to begin your suspension paperwork. As the panel members gathered their files and prepared to leave, Jamal approached Hank. Kilo trotted beside him, tail wagging, clearly happy to be reunited with his handler. I meant what I said, Jamal told Hank quietly. I do think you can do better. Why? Hank asked. Why are you willing to help me after what I put you through? Jamal smiled, the same gentle expression that had confused Hank so much during their first encounter. Because holding on to anger doesn't change anything, and because your dog never gave up on you, maybe I shouldn't either. Kilo sat down between them, looking up at both men with what could only be described as satisfaction. His tail swept the floor in a steady rhythm, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. He's a good judge of character, Hank said, reaching down to scratch Kilo's ears. The best, Jamal agreed. Maybe we should all try to see the world through his eyes. They walked out of the conference room together. Hank realized that for the first time in weeks he felt something he hadn't expected to feel again. Hope. The road ahead would be difficult, and he knew he'd have to earn back the trust he'd lost. But with Kilo beside him, and Agent Washington willing to guide the process, maybe redemption was possible. Maybe his dog had been right all along. 6 months later, Officer Hank Miller walked through the same Riverside Park where he'd first encountered Agent Washington, but everything had changed. The suspicious glances and whispered conversations that had followed him through his early community service hours had gradually given way to tentative nods of acknowledgement, and now, to his amazement, actual conversations. Kilo trotted beside him, no longer part of a patrol unit but working as a community engagement canine, visiting schools, participating in neighborhood safety presentations, and serving as a bridge between law enforcement and the people they served. Morning, Officer, Miller called out Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who had been one of his harshest critics during the early days of his community service. She was sitting on a bench with her granddaughter feeding ducks at the small pond. Morning, Mrs. Rodriguez. How's Alina doing? With her reading, the 8-year-old looked up shyly. I finished the book about the police dog, she said quietly, the one Agent Washington recommended. Hank asked, crouching down to Elena's eye level, what did you think? I liked how the dog helped people, like Kilo does. As if summoned by his name, Kilo padded over to Alina, sitting patiently while she petted his head. The interaction that had once seemed so putzlinga, police dog choosing gentleness over aggression, seemed like the most natural thing in the world. Hank's radio crackled softly. Unit 23. We have a request for community assistance at Jefferson Elementary. Teacher needs help with a situation involving a frightened child. Unit 23, responding. Hank replied, recognizing the school it was where Agent Washington taught, though Hank had learned that Jamal's cover as an art teacher had been completely legitimate. He actually held a master's degree in education and had been teaching part-time for years as a way to stay connected to the community he was investigating. 20 minutes later, Hank and Kilo walked through the familiar halls of Jefferson Elementary. Students waved at them from classroom windows. Kilo had become something of a celebrity during their monthly school visits. Met them at the main office, looking concerned. Thanks for coming so quickly. We've got a situation with Tommy Martinez. Hank recognized the name. Same child they'd rescued from the hostage situation 6 months earlier. What's going on? His mother says he's been having nightmares again today. He completely shut down during class, won't talk to anyone, won't come out from under his desk. I thought maybe Kilo could help. They walked down the hallway to a second-grade classroom where a small crowd of concerned adults had gathered. The rest, teacher, the principal, a school counselor, and Tommy's mother, Maria Martinez. He's been doing so well, Maria was saying, tears in her eyes. The therapy seemed to be working, but this morning something just triggered him. Through the classroom window, Hank could see a small figure huddled under a desk in the corner, knees drawn up to his chest, completely withdrawn from the world around him. Has anyone been able to get through to him? Hank asked. The counselor tried. For an hour, the principal replied. We called his mother, but he won't respond to her either. That's when Agent Washington suggested we call you. Hank looked at Kilo, who was already focused on the classroom, ears alert but posture relaxed. In their of community work, they'd encountered dozens of situations, like children traumatized by violence, afraid of police, struggling to trust adults who claimed they wanted to help. Can we clear the hallway? Hank asked. Sometimes crowds make it worse. As the adults moved away from the door, Hank knelt beside Kilo. What do you think, boy? Can you help? Kilo's tail gave a gentle wag, and together they entered the classroom. Hank stayed near the door, while Kilo approached Tommy's hiding spot slowly. Eventually, Lying down a few feet away from the desk for long minutes, nothing happened. Tommy remained curled up in his protective ball while Kilo waited patiently, occasionally shifting position but never approaching closer than the child seemed comfortable with. Then, so quietly that Hank almost missed it, Tommy spoke. "Hi. Remember?" Kilo's ears perked up, but he didn't move. "You were there that night." When the police came, Hank felt his throat tighten, remembering that terrible evening when Tommy had been trapped in his apartment with his mother's violent boyfriend. "Are you going to arrest someone?" Tommy asked, still not looking up. Before Hank could answer, Kilo did something remarkable. The dog army crawled closer to the desk, then rolled over onto his back. Ultimate gesture of non-aggression, vulnerability, and trust. Tommy finally looked up, and when he saw Kilo lying upside down with his paws in the air, he couldn't suppress a small giggle. "Why is he doing that?" "He's showing you that he's not scary," Hank said gently, moving slowly to sit cross-legged on the floor. "Sometimes when people are scared, Kilo wants them to know he's a friend." Tommy crawled out from under the desk and sat down next to Kilo, who remained on his back, tail wagging. The child placed a small hand on the dog's chest, feeling his heartbeat. "I had a bad dream," Tommy said quietly. "Want to tell me about it?" "I dreamed that angry man came back, and this time nobody came to help." Hank felt the weight of those words. This child's sense of safety had been shattered, and it was going to take time, patience, and consistent positive experiences to rebuild it. "Tommy," Hank said carefully, "do you remember how that night ended?" The boy nodded. "You were scared, but you were also brave. You listened to Mr. Washington's voice, you moved to where we could help you, and you got out safe. And you know what?" Tommy looked up at him. "All of USM, Mr. Washington, Kilo, all the other officers were still here. We're still watching out for you. That angry man can't hurt you anymore, and if you ever feel scared again, you can call us." Tommy continued petting Kilo, who had rolled back over and was now sitting calmly beside the boy. "Will Kilo come if I'm scared?" "If you need him, absolutely." Jamal appeared in the doorway, having been watching from the hall. "Tommy, your mom is here. She's been really worried about youth." Child looked up at his teacher, then at Hank, then at Kilo. "Can Kilo walk with me to see my mom?" Of course. As they walked down the hallway together, holding onto Kilo's harness, Hank walking beside them, and Jamal following behind. Hank reflected on how much had changed. 6 months ago, his presence in this school would have been as an enforcement officer, someone to be feared, or at least viewed with suspicion. Now, he was part of the community's support system in the main office. Tommy ran to his mother, who scooped him up in a fierce hug. Over the child's shoulder, she looked at Hank with gratitude. "Thank you, Maria," said both of you. As they prepared to leave the school, Jamal walked with them to the parking lot. "That was good work in there," he said. "Kilo did all the heavy lifting," Hank replied. "I'm just learning to follow his leads." Speaking of following leads, Jamal said, "I got some interesting news. Today, the department is launching a new program, Community Police Partnership Initiative. They want teams of officers and community volunteers to work together on problem solving, relationship building, conflict resolution." Guess whose name came up as a potential coordinator? Hank stopped walking. "Mine. Yours, Captain Reynolds. Thinks your experience, Beth, the mistakes and the recovery gives you a unique perspective on what needs to change." The possibility was both exciting and terrifying. Hank had spent the last 6 months focused on rebuilding his reputation and learning to serve his community better. The idea of helping other officers navigate the same journey felt like both an opportunity and a huge responsibility. "What do you think?" Hank asked. Jamal smiled. "I think your dog knew you were leadership material long before you did." As if responding to the compliment, Kilo sat down and looked up at both men, tail wagging steadily. "There's one more thing," Jamal said. "The program would involve a lot of public speaking, community presentations, sharing your story with other departments. Are you ready for that kind of visibility?" Hank thought about the question seriously. 6 months ago, the idea of publicly discussing his failures would have been humiliating. Now, it felt like an opportunity to help others avoid the same mistakes. "If it helps other officers learn to see the world through their dog's eyes," Hank said. "Finally, then yes, I'm ready." 3 weeks later, Hank stood at a podium in the Civic Center's main auditorium, looking out at an audience of police officers, community leaders, city officials, and citizens. Beside the podium, Kilo lay in a downstay, calm and alert. "My name is Officer Hank Miller," he began, "and I want to tell you about the day my dog taught me how to be a better cop." The story that followed was honest, painful, and ultimately hopeful. Hank described his assumptions, his biases, his failures, but also the possibility of redemption, growth, and genuine community partnership. In the front row, Agent Washington listened with a smile. Beside him sat Tommy Martinez and his mother, Elena Rodriguez, and her grandmother, Mrs. Rodriguez, from the park, and dozens of other community members who had become part of Hank's extended family over the past months. When Hank finished speaking, the applause was warm and sustained. But what meant the most to him was the sight of Kilo getting up from his position and walking over to sit beside the podium, looking out at the audience with what could only be described as pride. During the question and answer session that followed, a young officer raised her hand. "Officer Miller, what's the most important thing you've learned through this process?" Hank looked down at Kilo, then back at the audience. "I learned that sometimes the most important voice in the room is the one that can't speak with words. Dogs don't see color, they don't carry assumptions, they don't let fear override their judgment, they just respond to what's actually there. A kindness, threat, truth, deception. He paused, gathering his thoughts. If we're going to serve and protect our communities, we need to learn to see people the way our dogs don't, it through the lens of our biases and assumptions, but as they actually are. Sometimes the best training we can get is to just follow our canine partners' lead and trust their judgment. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Jamal approached with Tommy, who was carrying a drawing he'd made during the presentation. "This is for you and Kilo," Tommy said, handing over a piece of paper covered in crayon drawings of a police officer, a dog, and a small boy, all smiling under a bright yellow sun. "Thank you, Tommy. This is going on my office." Wallace. They walked out of the Civic Center together. Hank realized that his story had come full circle. He'd started as a police officer who thought he knew how to read people and situations. He'd become someone who nearly destroyed his career because of his own blind spots, and now he was becoming something new, a bridge between law enforcement and community, guided by the wisdom of a dog who had never stopped believing in the possibility of redemption. Kilo trotted beside them, tail wagging, finally confident that his human had learned to see the world with clearer eyes. The dog had been patient, persistent, and ultimately right about everything that mattered in the end. It had just taken time for everyone else to catch up to what Kilo had known all along, that justice isn't about assumptions or fear, it's about treating every person with the dignity and respect they deserve, regardless of how they look or where they come from. As they reached the parking lot, Hank knelt down beside his partner. "Good boy, Kilo. You've been right about everything from the beginning." Kilo's response was a gentle lick on Hank's cheek and a tail that wouldn't stop wagging, the universal language of a dog who had successfully trained his human to be the best version of himself. Their story had become more than just a tale of redemption. It had become a blueprint for change, proof that with patience, humility, and the wisdom to listen to those who see more clearly than we do, even the most entrenched biases can be overcome. It all started because a police dog refused to obey an order that went against everything he knew to be right. Sometimes the best teachers have four legs and never say a word.